The Pacific sky hung pale and endless that morning, an ocean of thin white clouds floating far above another war below. From the east, 27 silver shapes drifted into view. The new American bombers, the B-29 Superfortresses. At 30,000 feet, their engines hummed in flawless rhythm, a metallic choir carried by jet streams. Inside a Japanese Zero, Lieutenant Kato squinted against the glare. "Enemy bombers, heading north," he barked into the radio. Below him, the squadron formed up, sleek fighters diving through sunlight toward the oncoming giants. Then something impossible happened. The B-29s didn't scatter. They didn't climb or dive in panic. The entire formation tilted as one, a slow, graceful roll, their paths curving together like synchronized machines. Tracer rounds arced across the sky. Every gun turret came alive, firing with precision that looked more like mathematics than men. Kato's wingman screamed over the radio, his Zero spiraling down, smoke trailing. How are they moving like that? Above the clouds, the bombers held formation, unbroken, turning midair as if guided by one invisible mind. That day, Japan's pilots realized something new had entered the war. By early 1944, Japan's empire had begun to contract. What once stretched from Burma to the Solomon Islands was now a patchwork of scarred airfields and shattered coastlines. Supply routes bled dry under American submarines, and every gallon of fuel that reached the home islands was a victory of its own. In Tokyo, military briefings grew quieter with each passing month. Commanders no longer spoke of expansion. They spoke of endurance. The empire was still vast on paper, but paper couldn't hold the weight of reality. The skies, once Japan's proudest frontier, had turned into its most fragile defense. The Mitsubishi Zero, that slender, nimble fighter that once ruled the Pacific, was now meeting a new kind of enemy. Heavier, faster, relentless. From distant islands, rumors spread. The Americans had built a bomber that could climb above the reach of anti-aircraft guns and fly farther than any before it. It could carry 10 tons of explosives and still cross oceans. The B-29 Superfortress. At first, the Japanese didn't believe it. A machine that large couldn't fly that high. Not with such precision. Not with such range. Yet by the summer of 1944, reconnaissance reports confirmed the nightmare. The new bombers were coming from an island few had ever heard of before the war. Saipan. Its capture by American forces in July 1944 had changed everything. From there, the B-29s could reach Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, the heart of Japan itself. In underground bunkers, maps were redrawn. Commanders drew circles around Saipan, tracing the flight paths that could lead directly to the emperor's palace. The war that had once been fought in distant jungles and coral atolls was now at Japan's doorstep. Inside the Imperial General Headquarters, the mood darkened. Reports from pilots were grim. They couldn't reach the bombers in time. By the time Japanese fighters scrambled, the B-29s were already releasing their payloads and vanishing into the thin stratosphere. To fight them, Japan needed altitude, and technology they didn't yet possess. Engineers worked feverishly, designing interceptors like the Ki-44 and Ki-84, desperate attempts to match American altitude and speed. But production was slow, fuel was scarce, and training new pilots was nearly impossible. Meanwhile, morale among the air units began to crumble. Veterans watched young recruits, boys barely out of school, take to the skies with trembling hands and outdated planes. They knew what awaited them. Against the B-29s, even bravery had limits. By late 1944, Japan's air strategy had shifted from control to desperation. When you can no longer stop an enemy, you try to slow them. And when you can't slow them, you sacrifice everything to make them hesitate. Thus began the dawn of the Kamikaze. Yet even as suicide attacks took shape, the Americans kept refining their tactics. Each bombing run grew more precise, more devastating. Entire cities disappeared under blankets of fire. The Japanese military couldn't understand how their opponents were coordinating such perfect, mid-air formations. They believed, wrongly, that each B-29 acted independently. In truth, American crews were being guided by a new kind of intelligence, radar coordination and centralized mission command that turned the chaos of the skies into a choreographed storm. For the first time, Japan faced not just superior machines, but a new way of waging war, one built on data, communication, and endurance. And by the winter of 1944, the sound of those massive engines, the deep, unbroken hum of the B-29s, became a sound that civilians began to dread in their sleep. When they came not for soldiers. They came for steel, for oil, for the cities that fed the empire's heart. And they came from the sky, cold, silver, and unstoppable. Before dawn on November 24th, 1944, American ground crews moved like ghosts across the runways of Saipan. The air was thick with diesel fumes and nervous anticipation. Under floodlights, silver fuselages gleamed, each one a cathedral of riveted metal built for a single purpose: to carry destruction across 1,500 miles of open ocean. This was mission number 13, the first B-29 raid on Tokyo. Commanded by General Emmett Rosie O'Donnell of the Firebombing Bomber Command, the objective was clear: cripple the Musashino aircraft engine plant, the heart of Japan's fighter production. 111 Superfortresses would take off in waves, each carrying 500-pound bombs, and the hopes of an entire nation that this new weapon could end the war sooner. Engines roared in unison. Propellers blurred into silver discs. Crewmen in flak vests climbed aboard, tugging oxygen masks into place. Navigators' tables were lit by red lamps. The final checklist was read in silence. At exactly 0245 hours, the first B-29 rolled down the runway and lifted into the Pacific darkness. One after another, engines thundered off the tarmac until the night sky was filled with hundreds of white trails arcing north, toward Japan. For nearly 7 hours, the formation flew in silence. Inside, the men fought fatigue and freezing temperatures at 30,000 feet. They wore electrically heated suits to keep their blood moving. Frost crept along the windows. Some closed their eyes and imagined home. Others stared into the blackness, counting down the miles to Tokyo. As the first light broke across the Sea of Japan, the radar screens began to glow. Below them, the outline of Honshu, the island that no enemy aircraft had reached in centuries, was now within range. Tokyo was just ahead. At 12:10 hours, sirens began to wail across the city. School children were herded into trenches. Factory workers looked skyward. To most Tokyo citizens, the sound was new, alien, like the low hum of a giant machine approaching from the sun. When the B-29s appeared, they were so high that many thought they were stars. Japan's defenders scrambled to meet them, Kai-44s and Kai-61s, climbing with every ounce of power their engines could muster. But by the time they reached altitude, the bombers had already opened their bays. At 12:23 p.m., Tokyo felt its first American bombs. Explosions rippled through the Musashino plant. Smoke rose over Tama and Kawasaki. Japanese gunners fired blindly into the sky, their shells bursting thousands of feet too low. The Superfortresses held formation, turning together as if moved by one hand, a sight that astonished enemy pilots. No Japanese commander had ever seen machines that could shift their entire formation mid-air without breaking rank. To the B-29 crews, the motion was routine. They were guided by the lead plane's radar and coded radio signals, their movements synchronized by precise training. What looked like impossible coordination was simply the result of a revolution in aerial warfare, the fusion of technology and discipline. Still, the mission was far from flawless. Jet stream winds, unknown at the time, scattered bombs far off target. Visibility was poor. Factories sustained damage, but production resumed within weeks. 19 B-29s were lost to mechanical failure and enemy fire. Yet the message was clear. The sky above Tokyo was no longer safe. In the following weeks, more raids came. Nagoya, Osaka, Yokohama. Each attack tested Japan's resolve and revealed the limits of its defense. For every fighter scrambled, for every anti-aircraft gun fired, the Americans sent more bombers. The Superfortress was living up to its name. Within the Japanese military, disbelief turned to shock. Pilots reported seeing entire formations turn in perfect unison, their silhouettes cutting across the clouds like gears in a machine. No one understood how such precision was possible, until later interrogations revealed the truth. What the Japanese mistook for miraculous coordination was the result of advanced flight command from within each bomber. Centralized direction, turret control systems linked to computers, and new communication protocols made the B-29 a flying network long before the digital age. And that realization, that technology had become the new weapon, would change everything in the months to come. Because if Japan could not match the machine, it would turn to the one thing machines did not have: the human spirit willing to die for the empire. For Japanese pilots, the enemy that appeared above Tokyo in late 1944 was unlike anything they had trained for. They were taught that courage could overcome machinery, that the warrior's spirit could pierce steel. But now, as they climbed toward those silver shapes at 30,000 feet, courage met a new kind of weapon: precision. Captain Haruo Araki, one of Japan's most skilled interceptors, once described the B-29 formations as walls of light. The sunlight reflecting off their polished wings was blinding, and their guns, remotely operated by periscopic sights, fired with chilling accuracy. Araki's squadron attacked from below, diving and rolling, but every approach ended the same: tracer lines cutting through the sky, cockpits shattering, wings breaking apart. He later admitted to a fellow pilot, "It was not a battle. It was like chasing a god you could not touch." Inside the B-29s, however, there was no sense of invincibility. Each crewman knew the danger of every mile. The Pacific winds could rip open an engine. A single shell could ignite the bomb bay. Yet there was a strange confidence in the machine itself, as though it were holding them together. Pilots trusted the autopilot system, nicknamed George, which could stabilize the massive aircraft during turbulence or formation maneuvers. Gunners trusted the analog computers that calculated lead angles automatically. The airplane, for all its metal and circuits, seemed to think faster than the men inside. Each formation moved as one living organism, turning, climbing, descending, guided not by instinct, but by instruments. To an outside observer, it looked supernatural. To the Americans, it was simply the mathematics of war. On the ground, Japan's military command watched with disbelief. Reports from fighter squadrons described bombers that could change direction mid-attack without breaking formation, a maneuver once thought impossible for heavy aircraft. The Imperial General Staff dismissed early reports as exaggerations, blaming pilot error. But after several missions, the truth was undeniable. The B-29s were rewriting the rules of air combat. For the first time in Japanese military history, technology had broken morale, before the enemy even arrived. Civilians began to lose faith in the divine wind. Propaganda posters promised that the Empire's pilots would protect the skies. But the people saw something else: massive aircraft flying in daylight, unbroken, untouchable. It wasn't just destruction that frightened them. It was precision. Every bomb seemed to find its rhythm, every turn, its logic. The enemy was not emotional. It was methodical. Yet even among all that superiority, the human stories endured. Inside one of the B-29s on that first Tokyo raid was Lieutenant Raymond "Red Knight," a bombardier from Kansas. He had never seen a city like Tokyo before. When the bomb bay doors opened, he felt the warmth of sunlight rush in, and for a second, just a second, he hesitated. He knew there were people down there. Later, in his journal, he wrote, "It's strange. From this height, the world looks peaceful. You don't see the faces, just the patterns. I think that's what saves us. The distance, the silence. Knight's words echoed the paradox of modern warfare. The more advanced the weapon, the greater the distance from its human cost. Meanwhile, Japanese anti-aircraft crews worked in smoke and chaos below, their hands blistered from the heat of the guns. Many of them were teenagers, drafted from schools, shouting coordinates into radios that barely worked. They fired blindly, praying the sky would answer. One of them, an 18-year-old named Masao, later recalled in an interview, "We could not hear our own guns anymore. Only the sound of something above us, constant, steady, not afraid." That sound, the deep, continuous hum of the B-29 engines, became the sound of inevitability. For engineers on both sides, the war had become a race of invention. The Americans had developed radar-guided bombing, central fire control systems, and the revolutionary Wright R-3350 engines that pushed the Superfortress higher than any interceptor could reach. The Japanese, despite their resourcefulness, lacked the materials and fuel to match such advancements. While Japan's factories struggled under blockade, American engineers worked in abundance, supported by industrial giants like Boeing, General Electric, and Chrysler. The result was a war machine, built not only to fight, but to endure. The difference showed in the sky. Japanese fighters could climb fast, but not for long. Their fuel was thin, their engines strained. The B-29s, on the other hand, could fly above 30,000 feet and still carry 10 tons of bombs. That altitude alone was enough to change the psychology of war. The Americans fought with precision. The Japanese fought with faith. And in the space between those two, between metal and spirit, the outcome of the air war was already being written. By late 1944, Japan's command structure was desperate for answers. How do you defeat a weapon that can think? How do you fight a formation that moves as one? The solution they chose was both tragic and inevitable. They decided to turn men into weapon. By late October 1944, Japan's air strategy had fractured beyond repair. The American B-29s had proven that altitude, precision, and mass coordination could neutralize even the fiercest interceptors. Each new raid left command centers in stunned silence, not only because of the destruction, but because no countermeasure seemed to work. The Japanese high command needed an answer that would terrify the Americans as much as the B-29s terrified Japan. That answer came in the form of a single word: kamikaze. It did not begin as an organized strategy. It began as despair. At the air bases of Luzon and Kyushu, young pilots, many barely trained, started speaking among themselves of sacrifice flights. Some commanders dismissed the idea as madness, but others, realizing the empire's crumbling defenses, saw in it a final weapon, not of technology, but of spirit. Rear Admiral Takejiro Onishi, one of the architects of the movement, described it in his diary with chilling clarity. "The only way left is for our young men to crash into the enemy. A body, when fused with steel, becomes a bomb no machine can match." It was the ultimate inversion of warfare. While America advanced toward mechanical perfection, Japan turned back to human sacrifice. Inside the barracks, pilots wrote farewell letters under dim lantern light. Some scribbled poetry. Others drew small portraits of loved ones they would never see again. Onishi himself wept while reading them, not out of regret, but out of the burden of necessity. The American bombers were not invincible, he believed, but they had reached a realm Japan could no longer touch with technology alone. The kamikaze was meant to restore the balance through willpower, to prove that the human soul could still terrify the machine. For many, it was not fanaticism. It was hopeless patriotism. Pilots lined up their planes, often old Zeros stripped of guns to make room for explosives, and painted the rising sun on their wings. On the morning of their mission, they were given a ceremonial cup of sake and a white headband with the word Hisho, certain victory. They bowed toward the east, toward the Emperor, and took off knowing that their flight would never end in landing gear. From the perspective of American bomber crews, the kamikaze phenomenon was as shocking as it was horrifying. On November 25, 1944, during a raid over the Philippines, radar operators aboard several B-29s spotted single-engine aircraft approaching at impossible speeds. They expected the usual evasive maneuvers, but instead of turning away, the Japanese planes kept coming straight into the bombers. Lieutenant Robert Nelson of the 19th Bomb Group recalled, "They didn't flinch, didn't break formation, just came right through the tracers. One of them hit the lead ship. It was like watching a star fall in daylight." For the first time, the Americans felt the emotional shock Japan had endured for months. Technology, precision, training. None of it could explain what they were seeing. It wasn't tactical warfare. It was human will weaponized. That realization spread quickly through the U.S. ranks. Commanders called for tighter defensive formations and increased escort coverage. But behind the discipline, a quiet unease grew. The enemy was no longer predictable. While the kamikaze caused real damage, sinking dozens of ships and destroying numerous bombers, it could not stop the industrial tide that powered America's war machine. Every loss was replaced, every bomber rebuilt. Japan's decision, though emotionally powerful, deepened its logistical collapse. Fuel shortages worsened. Training programs halted. Experienced pilots died faster than they could be replaced. In contrast, American factories in Kansas, Washington, and Texas continued to produce one B-29 every hour. Each one represented another unshakable square in the sky, another formation that could turn, regroup, and strike again. But the moral weight of the kamikaze campaign lingered. Even hardened American soldiers felt conflicted. Major Henry O'Neill, a B-29 pilot, said after the war, "We respected their courage. We hated what it made us do. You can't feel victory watching a man turn himself into a weapon." That sentiment would later echo in countless post-war reflections, proof that even amid triumph, humanity was uneasy with what the skies had become. The kamikaze marked a grim threshold. It revealed that World War II had moved beyond strategy and into ideology, where machines and men were both consumed by the same endless fire. For the Americans, it reinforced their belief in mechanized dominance. For the Japanese, it became the final expression of loyalty in a dying empire. When the next wave of B-29s rose over the Pacific, they faced not only flak and fighters, but a new enemy: silence. The kind of silence that comes before someone decides to die for a flag. In that silence, both sides realized something profound. The future of war would no longer belong to the bravest, but to the most advanced. And that truth would lead directly to the next phase, when technology would no longer just defend cities, but erase them. March 9th, 1945. Tokyo, 10:58 p.m. The night was still, almost unnaturally calm. Below, nearly 1 million civilians slept inside wooden homes and narrow alleyways that stretched for miles. Above, the faint hum of engines began to gather, low and distant, like thunder on a dry night. There were 334 American B-29 bombers, in total, flying from the Mariana Islands. They were led by Major General Curtis LeMay, a man who had studied the failures of high-altitude precision bombing and was about to try something brutally new. LeMay's order was simple: fly lower, drop incendiaries, burn the target, not the factory. It was the first time America would turn fire into a weapon of strategy. At 5,000 feet, the first bomb bay doors opened. The darkness over Tokyo cracked into color. Napalm and magnesium-filled clusters began to fall, each one splitting midair into dozens of smaller canisters. They landed with soft thuds, then roared into life. Within minutes, entire neighborhoods burst into flame. Until that night, Japan believed that the B-29 raids were terrifying but survivable. that precision attacks on factories could be endured. But this was not a precision strike. This was annihilation through oxygen. The firestorm spread block by block, wind feeding on flame, flame feeding on wind. Temperatures reached 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Wooden beams turned liquid. Asphalt boiled. Eyewitnesses later described rivers catching fire, their surfaces layered with floating oil from burned boats and warehouses. The heat was so intense that it pulled people off the ground, sucked them toward the inferno's core. From above, the B-29 crews could see the effect with horrifying clarity. Sergeant William Hale of the 505th Bomb Group said later, "We saw the fires merge. It wasn't one city anymore. It was one flame, a sea of orange that kept climbing toward us. The pilots flying at 5,000 feet had to climb through rising air columns that tossed their 60-ton bombers like toys. Inside the cockpits, crews could smell the burning city through their oxygen masks." For the first time, technology had crossed a moral frontier. LeMay's experiment worked. Too well. By dawn, 16 square miles of Tokyo were gone. More than 100,000 people lay dead. Another 1 million were left homeless. The B-29s returned to base without a single loss from enemy fighters. Japan's air defense system had simply ceased to exist, blinded by its own smoke. Yet among the crews, silence filled the debriefing rooms. Some were proud, others visibly shaken. Captain Jack Arnold recalled, "We were told it would shorten the war. I believed that, still do. But when you see a whole city disappear, it doesn't feel like victory." The mission changed the tone of the entire Pacific campaign. From that night onward, the objective was no longer to defeat Japan's army. It was to erase its capacity to exist as a war-making nation. In Tokyo, the survivors emerged from cellars and canals at dawn. Smoke clung to the ruins like fog. The imperial palace still stood, untouched, a black silhouette against a red horizon. Emperor Hirohito was informed at 7:10 a.m. He asked only one question: was the palace damaged? The answer was no. The rest of the city was gone. For the first time, Japan's high command realized that the B-29 was not a bomber. It was a new form of warfare, one that made entire strategies obsolete overnight. The moral weight was devastating. Military leaders saw the futility, but no one dared to speak it aloud. In private, Prime Minister Suzuki murmured, "We are fighting an empire that manufactures storms." Curtis LeMay was criticized by some of his own officers. "General," one colonel said, "we've become the fire we're supposed to fight." LeMay's response became one of the most quoted lines in military history. If you kill enough of them, they stop fighting. It was brutal logic, but effective. Within weeks, the same firebombing technique was repeated over Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. Each city became another test site for the evolution of destruction. The Japanese interceptors tried to adapt, but the B-29's new low-altitude tactics nullified radar and reduced interception chances by nearly 80%. By May, the Japanese Air Force was a shadow of its former self. The skies now belonged entirely to the United States. That night, March 9, 1945, marked the moment when air warfare became something more than strategy. It became science stripped of emotion, precision fused with horror. The bombers that returned to their bases didn't just carry victory reports. They carried the proof that man could burn a city faster than he could rebuild it. And in the ashes of Tokyo, the world would soon glimpse the next, even darker invention that would end the war altogether. In the days following the Tokyo firebombing, Japan's airfields were filled with silence. The pilots who returned from night interception missions landed without words, faces gray with disbelief. They had seen something impossible. Vast bomber formations that seemed to move like a single living creature, bending and turning midair, reorganizing themselves even under attack. Radar operators reported targets appearing, vanishing, and reappearing miles away. Fighter squadrons scrambled into the night, only to find that the bombers were gone, or worse, waiting above them in perfect layered formations. It wasn't just American numbers that overwhelmed Japan. It was precision, mechanical, mathematical precision, that seemed almost inhuman. Inside the Imperial General Headquarters, reports began to pile up. Pilots described bombers that changed altitude as one, that rotated defensive positions mid-flight, that counter-turned entire formations to shield damaged aircraft. The Japanese intelligence officers, accustomed to the clumsy high-altitude raids of earlier years, now faced a truth they had long dismissed. The Americans had mastered air formation control through machine synchronization. The term whispered in the war rooms was Joku no Shiro, the castles in the sky. Each B-29, equipped with central fire control computers, could direct its 4 machine gun turrets automatically. Gunners no longer needed to manually lead their targets. The analog computers did it for them. When Japanese fighters dove in from the rear, they were met not by scattered bullets, but by intersecting streams of fire that tracked their paths with chilling accuracy. It was warfare conducted through algorithms before the word even existed. The pilots who survived their runs returned shaken. Lieutenant Kiyoshi Ogawa, one of Japan's most skilled interceptors, described his final mission. They moved as if connected by an invisible thread. We could not break them. When one fell out of formation, the others closed in to protect it. It was not flying, it was breathing. Japan's older Zero fighters, once the pride of the Pacific, now felt like relics from another century. They lacked altitude, range, armor, and radar guidance. Their pilots relied on instinct. Their opponents relied on computation. By early 1945, Japanese command realized the unthinkable. They were fighting against machines that learned faster than men could adapt. Curtis LeMay's B-29 groups had introduced a new doctrine, the rotating box formation. Each squadron of 12 bombers could turn in formation, bank as a single mass, and redirect midair without losing spacing. From the ground, it looked impossible. Hundreds of aircraft moving as if choreographed. To Japanese eyes, it was supernatural. A captured American manual later revealed the process. The B-29 navigators and formation leaders used synchronized drift meters, intervalometers, and visual light codes for signaling turns. Each bomber's autopilot was calibrated to respond in fractions of seconds. What looked like instinct was, in truth, engineering. Japanese observers at the Yokosuka Naval Air Base wrote a desperate note in their post-raid summary. "We cannot combat moving walls of fire. Their formations turn like a fleet of ships in the sky." It was a confession of defeat, hidden inside official language. The skies over Japan, once guarded by proud aviators who had dominated the Pacific in 1942, were now the stage for a new kind of war. One no human pilot could control alone. When the Imperial General Staff convened to discuss countermeasures, suggestions bordered on despair: kamikaze tactics, high-altitude balloons, night fighter ambushes. All were proposed. None were effective. The truth was brutal. Japan's industrial capacity could no longer produce what the Americans now deployed effortlessly: machines that thought in patterns. In the following weeks, the firebombing campaign continued. Each city that vanished was not merely a target, but a test of coordination, fuel management, aerodynamics, and timing. The Japanese air defense network, once intricate, now existed only on paper. Commanders ordered intercepts knowing full well their pilots would not return. And yet, within the surviving squadrons, a kind of reverent fear took hold. They spoke of the bombers not as planes, but as entities, giant steel birds that could bend the air to their will. In underground bunkers beneath Tokyo, engineers studied fragments of downed B-29s. They found aluminum alloys lighter than anything Japan could manufacture, wiring harnesses that seemed impossibly complex, and gun turrets guided by gyroscopic sensors. Each discovery deepened the humiliation. The American bombers were no longer simply aircraft. They were flying fortresses powered by the future itself. By the time the war reached its closing months, every Japanese pilot who took off against a B-29 understood the odds. They weren't fighting men anymore. They were fighting a system, a creation of science so advanced that courage no longer mattered. And as the glow of burning cities spread across the horizon, one truth became clear inside every Japanese command post. The air war had already been lost, not in the skies, but in the minds of those who still believed man could outfly the machine. By the spring of 1945, Japan's sky had become a map of loss. Every airfield, every radar post, every lookout station reported the same story. The bombers came, the cities burned, and nothing could stop them. The B-29, once dismissed as an oversized target, had become the symbol of inevitability. Factories in Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, all lay in ruins. Trains no longer carried munitions. They carried ashes. Steel foundries once used for Zero engines now smoldered. Their molten furnaces turned cold. Japan's war machine had stopped breathing. From the Mariana Islands, the missions continued with mechanical rhythm. Crews rotated in and out, bombers loaded, targets changed. But the results were the same. Each sortie returned with photographs, blackened grids where cities used to stand. LeMay's doctrine of total destruction was not cruelty. It was efficiency. The United States had turned industry into a form of warfare. Every rivet, every gallon of fuel, every circuit inside a bomber represented the weight of a nation that had learned how to mass-produce dominance. Detroit, Seattle, Wichita, these were not cities anymore. They were assembly lines for victory. For Japan, the contrast was unbearable. The Zero fighter, once the terror of the Pacific, now struggled to reach the bombers that cruised at 30,000 feet. Fuel was rationed. Rubber was gone. Pilots trained for years only to fly a handful of missions before dying in flame or smoke. Their courage was unmatched, but courage could not replace machinery. In underground bunkers, military engineers tried to imagine countermeasures. One report suggested using night-flying suicide planes, with explosive charges strapped beneath the wings. Another proposed swarming the B-29s with small, rocket-assisted interceptors. But the factories that might have built them no longer existed. Tokyo's firebombing had erased more than a city. It had erased Japan's belief in technological parity. Each new raid deepened that wound. Even when the B-29s flew at lower altitudes, vulnerable theoretically, no interception could reach them in time. They dropped fire, and then they vanished back into the stratosphere, untouchable. The American crews, meanwhile, began to feel the burden of their success. What had started as a military operation now felt like an act of nature, unstoppable, impersonal. Pilots who once cheered mission briefings grew quiet. The scale of destruction had outpaced emotion. Sergeant James Doyle, a flight engineer from the 497th Bomb Group, wrote in his logbook, "The cities look like maps on fire. You stop seeing people. You start seeing patterns." This was modern war distilled. Data replacing empathy, precision replacing courage. And yet, beneath the efficiency, a new moral weight began to take shape in both nations. Japan's Prime Minister Suzuki, in a rare moment of honesty before his advisors, said softly, "We are no longer fighting a war. We are enduring an ending." Inside the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito remained outwardly calm. He continued to receive reports with quiet nods, asking only about specific areas: Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama. But behind his composure, the imperial household had begun preparing for the unthinkable: surrender. In Washington, the war planners saw something different. The success of the B-29 campaigns validated a terrifying new idea: that air power alone could determine the outcome of global conflict. Factories could be destroyed faster than armies could march. Civilian morale could be shattered without invading a single beach. It was the first glimpse of the post-war doctrine. That victory belonged to the side that could command the sky. But as the flames consumed the Japanese mainland, Even the American High Command wondered if there was any line left to cross. General LeMay, now both praised and feared, admitted to a journalist after the war, "If we'd lost, I'd have been tried as a war criminal." The bombers that returned from Japan no longer carried the same spirit they had left with. They were efficient, disciplined, and hollow. The sky had become a factory floor, and humanity was the raw material being burned away. Still, the campaign continued. One by one, Japan's remaining industrial cities were erased from the map: Kobe, Yokohama, Nagoya, each reduced to ash within hours. And somewhere within that silence, the final stage of the war began to take shape. A weapon that would make even the firestorms of Tokyo look small. Because in the laboratories of New Mexico, another machine was being assembled. One that would not need fleets, or formations, or even pilots. The end would soon arrive on a single plane, and the fire that followed would not spread. It would erase. The Second World War ended not with a charge, but with a whisper. Not with soldiers advancing, but with shadows fading from walls. Humanity, for the first time, had created a sky that could decide the fate of nations. The B-29 Superfortress, once a machine of rivets, propellers, and sweat, had become the symbol of something larger. The moment when engineering outpaced empathy. It was no longer just a bomber. It was proof that war could be fought without ever seeing the faces it destroyed. From Tokyo to Hiroshima, the lesson was written not in victory, but in silence. Cities that once glowed with life became pale maps of ash. Generations would rebuild, but the memory would stay. A reminder that technology is never neutral. It inherits the intent of its maker. Curtis LeMay would later admit in an interview, "If we'd lost the war, I'd have been tried as a war criminal." It was an admission few generals ever made, and it captured the paradox of progress. Because the same hands that designed destruction also built the peace that followed. The engineers who perfected the B-29 later helped launch satellites, guide space missions, and power the atomic age's civilian dawn. The same science that ended lives would, in time, extend them. But somewhere above that balance, between innovation and consequence, lies the truth of the 20th century. That war, once fought on fields and seas, had moved into the sky. And in that sky, humanity learned both its power and its limits. Even today, when aircraft cross the Pacific under peaceful banners, they trace the same invisible routes once followed by bombers. Every contrail across the blue is a line written over history's wounds, thin, distant, and fragile. The pilots who once filled those skies grew old and quiet. Many refused to speak of what they'd seen. Some called it duty. Some called it horror. But all agreed on one thing, that from the fire above Tokyo to the light over Hiroshima, the world had witnessed something it could never unsee. The war ended. The cities rebuilt. But the sky remembered everything.